Welcome to another episode of the Expert Series, where we talk with industry leaders about tips and trends facing their sector and how they're navigating them for success. With us today is Stephen Morris. We're talking e-commerce. Stephen, how are you?
Very well, thanks, Steve. How are you?
Brilliant, brilliant. I appreciate you taking a bit of time out to share some insight with us. Do you want to tell the viewers a bit about your role and your brand?
Yep. So my name's Stephen Morris. Work for a company called OKA, who are a UK-based luxury furniture and homewares brand. Stores in the UK and the US, and trading online across both of those countries. And I look after all things digital, so digital marketing and the implementation of e-commerce.
Brilliant, brilliant. And I think you and I talked just before we jumped on about a report that Gravitas has recently published talking with UK e-commerce leaders, particularly those using the Magento platform, and some of the key challenges they're facing. And a couple of things struck me that I thought we might dive right into to hear your perspective. And so starting with that, one of the things that came out of the report is the sometimes misalignment between what the e-commerce leaders are hoping to get in terms of developer output and what they're actually getting. And one of the pinpoint causes could be the briefing process, specifically how to communicate the desired outcome to those developers. And I'm keen to hear how you approach briefing your e-commerce developers.
Well, we tend to adopt a bit of a horses for courses approach. So there are times when we absolutely need to brief something, and we have to really nut out the detail and brief something in that's pretty watertight. You know, if you need widget A that sits on page B and looks in a very particular way and does a very particular thing. I do think, though, there is always a stage in that process of engaging with developers, and whether that means that you effectively write the brief that you want to write, and then you talk to the developers through it and present it as a draft, and see if they've got anything that they can add or any concerns. Because if you hand them a fully finished brief and you don't get what you wanted at the end of it, you know, this extra stage, which might only be a half-hour chat over a coffee, might save days or weeks further down the line. And even further to that, I'd say there's examples of things that you can brief developers on where actually you can give them the opportunity to flex their development muscle. So a key talking point in the world of e-commerce and SEO over the past few years has been page speed. And whilst there are some, very good, highly technical SEO people who are able to go to developers and say, this is specifically what I need you to do. The approach that we prefer is to go and say, look, here are some standards that we are required to hit, and here are some specific metrics we need to achieve. And we need your support in achieving those. You've built this website, so how can you help us get to these standards and set a standard which will then use going forward in every piece of work we do, and give them the opportunity to take a bit of pride in that coding standard.
Yeah, that's really good input, and it really speaks to making the developers a partner in the process, not just coding, but developing with a commercial mindset, kind of an end in mind. And that really segues well to something else in the report. When I was reading through it, that kind of struck me is several e-commerce leaders talked about even the project management teams that might be the interface between themselves and the developers can sometimes get caught in a just tick the box to get the development task completed mindset, versus, again, really seeing the world through a commercial lens or commercial output of what are we actually trying to achieve to drive revenue. And I'm just curious about how you tend to navigate that and perhaps overcome that as avoiding the trap.
I mean, a personal view is that a PM needs to be aligned to commercial objectives, whether it's possible to do that within the structure of a business. If they sit within a tech function, whether they can have a dotted line into an e-commerce function and a link to the overall e-commerce strategy, there'll always be things that they need to deliver outside of a commercial responsibility. There's always patches, there's always fixes. But the approach that we tend to take is to ensure a strong commercial focus in the prioritization forum that we have. So we try to keep that quite a small group of people so that we don't get bogged down in lots of people asking for lots of little bits and pieces done. But that's the point at which we can influence from a commercial point of view. Like I say, there'll always be building blocks that have to be done, but then we can layer on that commercial aspect.
Yeah, that's great. And I'm curious, in that commercial prioritization, are the commercial reasons or rationale behind the prioritization, widely shared and understood so that the frontline project management teams or developers understand the why certain, prioritized, bits around the development roadmap versus others? I mean, because I would think that that would help them better understand, why things are in certain prioritization order.
Absolutely. So there will always be strategic elements that the devs and the project teams will be aware of, but we're trying to get better representation of the tech function within standard weekly commercial meetings, so that side of the business is at least aware of the commercial conversations that are happening. So as requests come through, a bit less of a surprise than they might be otherwise.
Yeah, that's really good. So it sounds like to overcome the challenge of having project managers and developers kind of out of sync with the commercial aspects of the business, these prioritization meetings and kind of sharing the rationale behind why certain things are being prioritized helps to educate them, I would think, it sounds like, and then align them so that you're all playing off the same playbook. That's quite good. Let's talk about data, data accuracy, and the subsequent use of that data for analysis to drive what you might optimize or changes you might make in the e-commerce site and site operations. What role is data playing for you, and what are some tips or thoughts that you have for peers thinking about the best ways to apply data to optimize their sites?
I think the most important thing with data is to actually invest in people who know it and understand it. So it's one thing to have access to a lot of data, but to have faith in its accuracy and understand what it means and what you can do with it is something totally different. To take it right back to the beginning, understanding the outputs of what you want to measure and actually what the inputs are in terms of a tagging requirement to ensure that you can get the data out that you want. And fully understanding the tool set that you have available, what each of those tools can tell you, what they can't tell you, importantly. But then having somebody who can really take all of those different data points, interpret it, form a hypothesis, and then make a recommendation for the business, either in terms of a permanent change or a test that you might want to run, I think is a really key member of the team.
Yeah, formulating hypotheses and then running tests against that are super important. Is that a dedicated analyst role for OKA, or is that something you're pushing out to agency, or is this something that falls on you?
It's something that falls within the e-commerce function, yeah. And at the moment, we are in the process of trying to hire a person for that role.
Really?
Simply because it's so key. And whilst everybody needs to be an analytics user and be able to use that and have that skill set, having somebody who's totally entrenched in it and understands it top to bottom is key for us.
Yeah, and I would think that, and you could certainly speak to this, that would inform some of those commercial prioritization conversations that you mentioned earlier.
Absolutely. Very aware that we have, through that kind of direct interface with the customer that the website is, we have a key line of sight to data that can inform business strategy going forward.
Yeah, brilliant. Another thing that struck me in the Gravitas report is the kind of tumultuous challenge of finding and retaining great Magento developers. It seems like the labor market is quite tight as we're exiting 2022. whether it's agency or full-time hire, attracting, retaining really good developers, particularly those that might know how to use other optimization tools, Adobe Experience Manager, et cetera. Super challenging. How are you navigating that yourself?
It is a very tough one, and if we're honest, it's something that we're kind of trying to better prepare for in terms of people moving on. So, you know, and I think we've probably learnt over the last 12 months that documentation really is a key mantra. So, you know, really cataloging how things work, particularly, you know, if you have licenses for particular plugins or elements, you know, who owns those licenses, who pays for those licenses, because it is a nightmare if you suddenly go out of license and you need to find out yesterday who pays for things. One thing that we have done as a kind of recent development is to try and transfer some of that kind of documentation and handover process into Microsoft Teams. So actually, rather than feel the pressure to have to write everything down, doing walkthroughs online, talking through things, and just recording those meetings makes the task a bit less onerous, and I think a bit less full of dread for whoever is having to create the documentation, and potentially a bit easier to find what you need when you're reviewing it.
I think it's a great tip for anyone managing an e-commerce stack, as you say, where you get into not just the major components, but you get into plugins, you get into bespoke code, you get into a lot of bits, you know, revision management, license ownership, reference architecture of how everything fits together. If you've got new developers coming in, other developers leaving, and you've got to get people up to speed quickly, I would think that's a great help.
Exactly.
Let's talk about UX. Another thing that struck me reading the Gravitas report, talking with UK leaders, is the need for more user experience design skills among the developers, not just functionally being able to code or configure an Adobe Commerce module to meet functional brief requirements, but bearing in mind, particularly for brands like yours that are luxury brands, there's a certain UX experience when you're talking about an e-commerce site as a brand touch point amongst your customers. So I'm curious, where do you go for UX inspiration, and how are you keeping UX fresh and aligned with the brand?
We have a recent example of this actually, where we had a specific couple of UX projects we hired a contractor for, and we had a very limited amount of time. So we had a 3-month time box to get this work done. So one of the things that we did was actually look at other Adobe Commerce merchants to give us an idea of the art of the impossible, so that we knew that when we engaged with the developers, we weren't asking for things that we knew they were going to say no to on day one. Beyond that, actually looking at, we know our customers very well, we know our industry very well. So taking a side step away from the industry and looking at other merchants and other websites in general that we know that our customers are likely to look at and engage with and use. So taking insights from, I can think of the most recent project we did, we looked at specific event websites of the kind of events that we knew that our customers would be going to, some sports apparel brands, electronics manufacturers, other brands that we knew that our customers would be engaging with, just to get a bit of inspiration, but keep it looking at those Magento merchants, relevant to Magento and relevant to our audience.
Well, I think there's a lot of insight in that tip, because I think it's easy to get stuck kind of just looking at design inspiration or even competitive feature sets from other people or other brands in your category. In your case, would be another luxury home goods brand. But I really like the idea of saying, well, let's understand the buyer and the other brands they're likely to interact with as part of their lifestyle behaviors, and how we can take inspiration from them. As you said, sports apparel, events, other things like that. Really, really good stuff. Let's talk about platform migration challenges. Again, in the Gravitas report, we saw a couple of e-commerce merchants talking about, £1 million fees for migration, and then all of the subsequent work that comes off the back of that when replatforming. I think you've been through a recent platforming experience not too long ago. You had shared. What tips or lessons learned could you share with other e-commerce leaders thinking about a replatforming?
So I think one key thing is to fully appreciate your requirements at the outset. Go in with a full understanding of what it is that you need. Make sure that everything that you need is in that brief, because anything that you add later down the line is going to cost more to get added in than it will do if you get it in on day one. And to always ensure that you've got some budget held back. This is akin to a major infrastructure project, and you'd never go into building an office building or something and not having some sort of funds available for when you hit a roadblock. So don't spend a lot on day one. And then it's going back to that documentation thing again. So ensuring that you're getting that done along the way, make sure that you're making time for it. Even when you get to, you'll always get to that phase in the project where you just need to get the thing over the line. Don't disregard the need for that documentation in those last crazy couple of weeks, because it could come back to bite you.
Well, Stephen, this has been really helpful. You've shared quite a few tips about how to properly brief the development team, aligning developers and project managers to commercial outputs, the importance of data to inform some of the commercial prioritization, and including possibly just looking at dedicated analyst talent, managing and navigating crazy developer markets right now for Magento developers. Certainly, you talked about SEO and speed and design elements. And you talked about, looking outside your category for UX inspiration for optimizing the site. Anything else that you might want to share with e-commerce leaders, particularly Magento platform customers, as they're planning for 2023?
No, I think just to reiterate that, the working with developers, working with UX people, SEO people, design people, there is value to be added at every single stage of this process, and ensuring that everyone is involved and everyone gets their say. Commercially, there needs to, you need to retain someone who is ultimately accountable for the project and who is delivering it. But ensuring that you give all of those people an opportunity to kind of, in the case of a creative person, flex their creative muscle, and get the best of everybody in the team. Is a team.
Brilliant. Well, we appreciate you coming on the Expert Series for this episode. Hopefully we'll have you on again. And until next time, good hunting.
Thanks, Steve.